Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 22nd, where I wanted to put some closure onto Lovecraft, and also wanted to talk a little bit about Shirley Jackson. You remember that I gave you an extension on our Lovecraft journal because I didn't quite complete Lovecraft. So that's going to be due today, Monday the 22nd, if you're watching this video on the 22nd, at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And at this point, I should be all caught up with my grading. The only thing that I've got left might be a revision if you've submitted in a revision, or if you have submitted in late work. So that's what I'm working on now. And for the Lovecraft quotes that I wanted to talk a little bit about, I first wanted to start with The Outsider and talk a bit about how that particular story begins. For me, it's on page 27 if you are using the edition of the text that I had ordered. And it begins with the Keats quote. And this helps to give Lovecraft an opportunity to not only establish mood, but it also perhaps gives Lovecraft an opportunity to show that he has a background in literature, Keats being one of the great romantic poets. And the poem reads, "That night the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests with shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm were long be nightmared." And as the story progresses, we see how Lovecraft continues to try to use literary elements such as alliteration, the initial repetition of consonant sounds. So we're told that, and this is in the first paragraph, the narrator is dazed and disappointed. Notice the repetition of D's. And the environment is barren and broken. Note the repetition of B's. Of course, the setting is established in a dismal chamber, an alone hour, passageways with cobwebs, everything we've come to expect in terms of the Gothic. And what we find out is that even though this individual believes that they happen to be in some sort of a chamber, what they really are in is a crypt. And that the individual has to crawl his way out of this crypt. What he thinks are trees are really roots. And then finally, when he makes it above ground and he's able to stagger onto a human party, he realizes that he himself is the monstrosity, that he's the dead corpse. In some ways, you might say this could be a continuation of Monkey's Paw, which we read during Halloween, if they had opened the door and they actually saw the monstrosity rather than the monstrosity being wished away with the last wish. And as we continue on in this story, the narrator talks about having dreams of twilight, twilight being a very mystical time. And hopefully you've gotten to the point too where you can see parallels with some of the earlier Gothic texts that we've been reading. There is a lot in this text that's reminiscent of Poe, for instance. And there will also be things that are reminiscent of other authors and some of the other stories that we will be reading. Lovecraft, I should say, is known for his use of description, and that perhaps is illustrated in page 31 of my edition, when he talks about the monstrosity, which is himself. It's unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, detestable, a ghoulish shade of decay and antiquity and desolation, putrid, dripping, and so forth and so on. A ghost being a restless spirit, something that we will talk about when we get to the haunting of Hill House. Of course, he finds out through touching the glass, and he sees a reflection of himself, that doppelganger or doubling image that we've become familiar with the Gothic. And then finally, references to things like the balm is Nepenthe, which is referenced in Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, for instance. It's a drug that causes forgetfulness. And when we go to Pickman's model, again, we see similarities right at the very beginning with Edgar Allan Poe, because we've got the I narrator. And we know that with Poe, we've got I narrators who maintain that they are sane. And of course, that's just further proof of their insanity. That's not the case with Lovecraft. Lovecraft, it's pretty clear that the supernatural elements exist. There is no ambiguity, such as in the other authors that we've read. So when in the beginning of Pickman's model, the narrator says, "You needn't think I'm crazy, Eliot," we might think, if we're familiar with Poe, what we're going to get is a crazy narrator. That's not at all what we end up getting. And then we find out a little bit about Pickman. And one of the things that we learn is that Pickman has two residences. They don't know, he says the police don't know about Pickman's North End place that he had under a pseudonym, the name of Peters. It reminds me a little bit of Jekyll and Hyde at this particular point, with the double doors, for instance, and the double identities. And then ultimately, what we find out is, after references to things like Old Salem, and there's lots of pagan references here and lots of supernatural references here, such as Cotton Mather's. This for me would be on page 37. He's known for the witch hunts. And Lovecraft was very deliberately doing things like that, making references to real historical figures to give his stories a sense of reality. And of course, that's the twist in this particular story, is that Pickman is not creating his art through imagination. He's creating it through mimicking real photos of true monstrosities that he's able to connect with in his residence. And then what we find out in his last piece, and of course there's a good number of Lovecraft stories in the text that I had ordered, and I was very pleased to see in the attendance question that some of you are now Lovecraft fans, so you may want to read a few additional stories just for your own benefit. But when we go to the Dunwich Horror, one of the reasons why I wanted to assign that particular piece, as I had indicated, is because it helps to establish the Cthulhu mythos, because Lovecraft is known very much for creating this basically alternate reality, and almost like a Tolkien-esque way. And we're told a little bit about witches and other night fears at the beginning. And it's set initially in north central Massachusetts, which gives it a sense of reality, and that there is a strange uneasiness that happens to be increasing. And they're outside of this town called Dunwich, which is quite isolated. And of course, we know that that's always a negative thing in the world of the Gothic. And there are references to things like Salem and Candlemas, which happens to be a festival for witches, again, making all kinds of pagan references in his writing. And we're told a little bit about the monstrosity that we think is going to be the star of this story, but it's not. And the description, again, Lovecraft can be very descriptive on page 104, that this thing was somewhat goatish or animalistic, with thick lips and large poor yellowish skin and coarse crinkly hair and oddly elongated ears. But of course, this continues on, and then there are references to things like the Boston Globe, which again sets this in reality, next to things like the Arkham Advertiser, which is fictional, but again, it gives a sense of reality, where we're told on page 106, or this is the third section of this particular story, that when the 1917 war came, that basically the local draft board found that it was difficult to find a quota of young Dunwich men fit enough to be sent to development camp, because there was such regional decadence. And they sent several officers and medical experts to investigate, conducting a survey. And it was the publicity supposedly attending this investigation which set reporters onto the town. And we had talked a little bit about the idea that Lovecraft was obviously rather judgmental, and was obviously rather racist in some of his writings, and you can definitely see that in terms of some of his discussion about these backwater individuals. And after references to things like May Eve and All Hallows, and of course other references to the occult, we find out that the twist is not that ultimately this monstrosity exists. And again, some of the ways that it's described after it's killed, And this is on page 114 of my text. This is Wilbur Whately, after he has been killed. The thing that lay half bent on its side in a pool of greenish yellow ichor. And I had mentioned the idea that Lovecraft likes very much, this idea of ichor. And above the waist, where there was the dogs rending paws still rested watchfully, the leathery hide of a crocodile or alligator, and the black was piebald and yellow and black and dimly suggested the covering of snakes. And below the waist it was worse, for here all human resemblance left off and sheer fantasy began, and the skin was thickly covered with coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long green-gray tentacles with red sucking mouths protruded. And in some ways, this does remind me of the kind of the Dracula story that we read, where we've got a scientist, Dr. Armitage, who basically is able to embrace not just science, but also the supernatural. And they try to confront what is happening after the loss of Wilbur, because strange events only increase rather than decrease. And in fact, one of the ways that they do so is by looking at a diary from Wilbur Whately. It reminds me of the epistolary novel that we've seen in Dracula and in Frankenstein. And of course, we find out that there was a twin brother, and that was the monstrosity that was really being hidden. Again, that idea of doppelganger or doubling. So, and there's also reference I wanted to point out to whippoorwills throughout the story. Whippoorwills are important in terms of some supernatural lore, that basically they are some of the most ominous birds in America, and their cry at night, especially if it happens to be near a house, is supposed to be a sign of a death to come. And notice how the whippoorwills are dead by the ending when they're able to defeat this monstrosity, the unnatural. And that gives us a sense a little bit of what Lovecraft's writings were like. And it seemed that just about unanimously, all of you thought that Lovecraft lived up to his goal of trying to emulate some of Poe's works. And we move on finally to something much more contemporary. So for those of you who had indicated that Lovecraft was a bit of an easier read because it seemed more contemporary, The Haunting of Hill House will be even more contemporary still. So Shirley Jackson, who hails from Vermont, supposedly claimed to be a practicing witch and had more than 500 occult books in her library. She wrote a short story called The Lottery that you may be familiar with. Let me just say that this is a lottery you do not want to win. I highly encourage you to read the story. It's oftentimes anthologized and read in English classes. Some of the things to think about with The Haunting of Hill House is that not only do we have a female author, Shirley Jackson, but this time we have a female lead in Ellie. And it's something that we talked about in Frankenstein that we did not have. We didn't have a female lead. We're going to see a good amount of psychological instability. There will be events that appear to be hauntings. They could be supernatural, they could be paranormal, or they could be psychological, or some combination thereof. And again, Jackson is a master of suggestion rather than coming out and directly indicating what something is the way Lovecraft does, with italics no less at the ending of the story. We're left to come up with our own conclusions. Now, the definitive version of The Haunting of Hill House is a film version called The Haunting, done in 1963. Now, it was remade, but I don't necessarily recommend the sequel or the remake. That said, the special effects are great, but I think that The Haunting, the original in 1963, does a wonderful job of creating atmosphere and mood. Directed by Robert Weiss. He's the director of West Side Story, if you're familiar. The movie was a critical success, which is kind of unusual for a horror film. It wasn't so much a box office success. Wonder if it was one of the reasons why is because it was shot in black and white, and at this point audiences began expecting color, and I don't think black and white has sort of earned its reputation for being an art form in the way that it does today. And we'll see as we've become accustomed with other adaptations in film, multiple text changes, even character name changes and plot changes. However, what I thought we could do is watch at least the first half of The Haunting, and then we could finish up with the last half next class. So you can see that in section 4 of our notes below, I've got a recommendation that you watch up to minute 55:36. That's a natural break in the film. And you've got the link below so that you can access that. And today's attendance question is going to be based on the film and also the text. That'll be due on Tuesday the 23rd at 8 a.m. But of course, if you need an extension, let me know. And the question is about titles. Why do you think the 1963 movie is named The Haunting rather than The Haunting of Hill House? Again, so I'm curious to see what your thoughts are. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about The Haunting of Hill House. Take care. Bye-bye.